certain way because plants speak chemistry. They don't behave, they deal with their environment through chemistry. The blue boxes here are what they call primary metabolites, which are pretty much universal metabolites. You have them, plants have them, everything has them. These are the molecules of life. But what's more interesting is the yellow boxes, which are so-called plant secondary compounds. They're not really secondary, they have a function. They're actually very functional in the plants. And there are many categories here, such as the nitrogen-containing compounds, which includes things like the alkaloids. The alkaloids are the drug-like molecules that many of our important medicines come from. And that's an important category. Also the terpenoids here, like the aromatic small molecular weight molecules that give flowers their fragrances, and the higher molecular weight terpenes like the so-called phytosteroids and so on. And each one of these boxes is, a 30,000-foot view of an enormous variety, structurally and molecularly speaking, of these molecules. So this is just a very sort of superficial diagram of these secondary compounds. What makes them secondary is they're not really secondary, but what makes them, why they're classified that way is they're not universal. These are not molecules that are necessary for life, but otherwise they'd be in every living thing. They occur in certain plants, certain families, so they're not necessary for life. Why do plants bother making these things, these secondary compounds? Well, as I said, plants mediate their relationships with their environment through chemistry. A famous botanist once said, plants substitute biosynthesis for behavior. Plants can't move around. They can't run away from danger and so on, so they rely on their chemical creativity to deal with that. So these secondary compounds are also messenger molecules that the plants produce through and that work on the ecosystemic level. They use these messenger molecules, largely small molecules, to mediate their relationship with other organisms in their environment. That's why I say chemistry is the language of plants. That's how they manage their relationships, and they use those to communicate with other plants, which might be about, spacing of populations. They use them to communicate with fungi and microorganisms in the soil. They form symbiotic relationships with those things. Insects and the whole pollination process that keeps plants going, that is a chemically mediated process. And they use them to interact with herbivores, things that might want to nibble on plants, and they might want them to, and they might not. And that includes us. So they use them to mediate relationships with humans too. And there's basically three broad categories of functions. One is defense. These are making toxins and repellents, that sort of thing. Things, chemical compounds where the basic message is, stay away, don't bother me. You don't want to bother me, you don't want to mess with me. But it gets more interesting when they use them for semiosis and symbiosis, which kind of go together. Semiosis is sending a signal, as in semaphore, it comes from the same root, right? So semiosis can be a kind of defense. The message, the semiotic message can be stay away. But it gets more interesting when the semiotic message is come closer. Let's form a relationship. In fact, let's form a symbiosis. And symbiosis is the close association of two different species, often for mutual benefit. And for a good example that it doesn't involve humans is the symbiotic relationships that plants form with the fungi in the soil. The fungi infect the roots and form these so-called mycorrhizal relationships that really help the plant in nutrient transfer and that sort of thing. And then symbiosis can also be on the human level. If we find something of use in a plant, a nutrient, for example, a medicine, whatever, our tendency is to cultivate that plant because it's useful to us. That's a semiotic relationship, a symbiotic relationship of a certain kind. We think that we cultivate the plants. Actually, think about it. The plants cultivate us. They turn us to their purposes. If you want more about that perspective, I highly recommend Michael Pollan's work, such as The Omnivore's Dilemma, for example. So this is a signal transduction function that plants carry out on the ecosystemic level. And many of the neurotransmitters that work in our brain evolved from the same evolutionary precursors as these plant messenger molecules. In some cases, they're identical to plant molecules. For example, the precursors for the biogenic amines like serotonin and dopamine, we do not make the amino acids that they are the precursors for those neurotransmitters. We have to get those from plants or by eating animals that make plants. So, it's a very close symbiosis. So you wonder, well, why are there so many psychoactive drugs in the environment? It's because they're the same molecules. We're all coming from the same ancestors, sometimes called the LUCA, way back, the likely universal common ancestor. So it's not surprising that neurotransmitters and plant chemicals are not that different from each other. In fact, they're often the same. And this statement of Salvador Dali, I do not take drugs, I am drugs. And if you think about that, that's true, because we are biochemical systems, our brains are biochemical systems, our whole bodies, mediated by signal transduction processes. And were those things not endogenous, if they were outside, we'd say they were drugs. But inside us, we say, well, they're neurotransmitters or hormones, but they're drugs, basically. So we're made of drugs. Sorry, the drug-free America people, it's just not gonna happen. So there is that. And that's really a kind of a very quick look at kind of the functionality of these secondary products on the organismic level and also on the ecosystemic level. So with that as a background,